So if you take your front and lay it down face right sides up, and then you're going to put the your back panel right sides together, making sure your quilting lines are lining up there, so you've got the top edges together. You've got a 2 centimetre seam allowance here at the top. So if you come down 2 centimetres from the top and just pin that top edge together, and we're going to fit your cover onto your overlocker machine. So the next thing to do, once you've pinned this together at the top, allowing 2 centimetre seam allowance, is just to drape that over the top of your overlocker, and you should find that the bottom edge of your overlocker cover just grazes the floor. You don't want it to be sort of puddling on the floor, and you don't want it to be swinging in mid-air. You just want it to touch the floor on both the back and the front. So that looks pretty good fit to me. Now, if you found that your overlocker cover was just a little bit too long, you don't want to adjust it at the bottom because you've done all this hard work here on the pockets. What you can do is take it in at the top. So you've got a 2 centimetre seam allowance. If you did want to take it in, just increase that seam allowance at the top until you get the right overall length of your cover. If, on the other hand, this was a bit too short and sort of swinging in the breeze here, then you can just let that out. You've got 2 centimetres on either side, so you could let it out by 1 centimetre or 1.5 centimetres on each side to increase the overall length of your overlocker cover. So once you're happy that that's okay, and I think mine is fine with the 2 centimetres, then we can sew this top edge together. But before we do that, let's just mark on the position of our handle. So we're quite happy with the overall fit of our overlocker cover. It seems to be a pretty good length. So let's just take a look at the top here. Because what we want to do is we're going to sew the seam together along the top, but we do want to leave a space just so that we can put our hand in and grab that handle in order to be able to carry our overlocker around. Now, not all overlockers have a handle at the top, and it really does depend. They vary quite a bit in their design. Some of them will have a handle round the back. And also, when I'm carrying my overlocker, I do like to also put a hand at the bottom to support it because it is quite a heavy machine anyway. But I will make a hole at the top here to allow my handle is just, in fact, if I show you, my handle is just here. Okay, so I want to be able to put my hand through my cover and grab my handle there so that I can carry my overlocker with the cover on it. So I just want to take my cover, and it's going to sit that way round, and then I can just pop that on there, and I think that I want to leave my hole for my handle. You'll notice that it's not completely central, it's offset towards the right hand side as we're looking at it here. So I want to leave a gap something like that. So if we now put those pins in there and there, in fact, if I put them like so, and then I can just flip that over the top. Let's just see. So just pin your cover, leaving a gap, and I can see now that if I put my hand through that hole, I'm directly on that overlocker handle there. So that's a really good place for me to have my gap for my overlocker handle. So I've marked that position on with those chalk marks. I can now sew this seam up, leaving a gap here. And if your overlocker does have a handle that's towards the back of the machine and it's not very easy to access, then I just suggest that you sew that seam all the way along and don't worry about the making the hole for your handle. So I'm going to sew with a 2 centimetre seam allowance. I did allow a nice big seam allowance on the top of this pattern so that you could make adjustments if your cover was too short. And then I'll just take those pins out as I go. I've pinned the 2 panels at the top edge right sides together, and I've matched up my quilting lines. So I just continue to sew along You can see my raw edge there is matched up with my 2 centimetre line. And you can see there's my yellow chalk mark, so I'm just going to come to that chalk mark there, and then I want to do a back stitch. And then I'll come down to my next chalk mark and start again. So I'll come to the next line there, taking off those pins as I go. Back stitch to start with, and then I'll sew all the way to the end. So that's done. We now just want to press that open and flat. You can see that I've got my gap there for my handle. So just press that whole area open and flat, including the area that you haven't sewn. So next we want to take our lining panels and do the same. So take your lining panels and put them right sides together. Excuse the shadows, it's a beautiful day and the sun is streaming in through the window. It's frosty outside, below 0, but bright blue skies and gorgeous sunshine. So I'm not complaining at all, but it does mean that there's a few shadows here. Sorry about that. So I want to put this right sides together, and then I'm going to pin or clip that. And then I'm going to sew together the top of my lining panels with a 2 centimetre seam allowance, same as my main panels. Now, if you left less or more than 2 centimetres, then obviously adjust that accordingly. You want to do the same with your lining as you have done with your main fabric. The other thing that we want to do very quickly is just to flip this over, and this is going to sit like this together. So it's eventually going to sit wrong sides together like this. So you've got your lining and your outer fabric, and I just want to mark on the area where I've left my gap for my handle. So I just want to make sure that I leave a gap in my stitching in the same place as my handle. So I shall just transfer those markings now. So I can see that my handle opening starts here and finishes here. So I'm going to sew this together, 2 centimetre seam allowance, stopping here, start here again, and sew all the way back to the bottom. And I know that my handle positions, once this is opened out, will be in the same place. So lining up with my 2 centimetre line there, remove the pins as I go, little back stitch to begin with. And I'm just going to stop at that chalk mark. Bring that forward to the next chalk mark. Back stitch. And sew to the end. And then we'll press that open and flat. Once that's pressed, we now want to put our lining and our outer fabric together. So put those together with wrong sides together, so you're looking at the right sides on both the back and the front. And we just want to line up those handle holes there, and we want to just line up the fabrics. They should match up. Don't worry if one overhangs the other slightly. The lining may be ever such a little bit bigger just because of all of the quilt work we've done on the outside fabric, on the main printed fabric there. So I've got those matched up nicely, and what I want to do now is just to attach the seam allowances together to keep everything lined up. So just pull back your lining and just pinch your seam allowances there. So I've just got my seam allowances, and my outer fabric and my lining are set back, and then I just want to clip those seam allowances together. So I'm just working with that seam allowance and nothing else. And then I'm going to sew the seam allowances together all the way along there. Then I'm going to flip it over, grab the seam allowances on the other side, clip those together, whoops, and sew those seam allowances together too, and that will help to keep everything together and in place. So you don't need to leave a gap for your handle because you're only sewing the seam allowances, so the gap will still exist. You're just securing the seam allowances together. Okay, so those are now secured together as well. So I'm going to sew down both of those seam allowances. So it doesn't really matter how far into the seam allowance you sew, and it depends on how wide the seam allowance is, but you just want to attach those seam allowances together. That will just keep the lining and the outer fabric of the cover secured together nicely. So you can see there's my seam allowances sewn together, and then when we open that out, there's your handle hole there. So the fact that we've sewn the seam allowance all the way down, you've still got your handle hole there. So let's just smooth all of that down, match up the lining with the cover itself, and put some clips all the way around the edge. So that quilt is now secured all the way around the edge with clips. What we'll do is we'll sew all the way around the edge to hold it in place. But before we do that, I'm just going to do a stitch line around the edge of this handle opening as well. So we'll work looking at the front of the machine cover. We'll use the width of our presser foot as a guide. We'll just sew through all layers in a rectangle around that opening just to give it a nice neat finish. So I'll work looking at the right side of my machine cover, place that under my presser foot. Now if you've got, I'm going to use my white thread or my off-white thread because that goes with both the yellow and the white or off-white fabric. If you've got very contrasting outer and lining fabrics, then you could put your thread colour in your bobbin to match your underneath fabric, and your thread colour on top to match your the fabric of your machine, outside of your machine cover. Now you'll see that I am starting halfway through the along the handle opening, and I'm lining up the edge of my presser foot with the edge of my fabric there, and I'm sewing through all layers. When I get to the end, I'll just go beyond by a few stitches, leaving my needle down in my fabric. I'll lift my presser foot and pivot round. Same again, just spin that round, foot down, and then once again I've got the edge of my presser foot matching up to the edge of the handle opening. So there's that stitch line going through all layers, which comes around the edge of my handle opening there. Now that I've done that, I can just come all the way around the outside edge of my quilt. Doesn't really matter where I start and stop, and just right within the seam allowance there. So I'm going to cover the whole edge of my cover with binding. So you're not intended to see these stitches. These stitches I'm going to do now just act as a holding stitch to hold all those layers together. It just makes it a bit easier on the next step when we're going to put binding around the edge. If you find that your cover is walking around a bit, just leave the needle down, lift your presser foot and smooth everything back down. Or you can use a walking foot if you have one. Or if you've got a hovering function for quilting, you can use the hovering function if you've got a more higher spec machine. I get to the corner, I'll just pivot round. You need to make sure as well that you've got plenty of space around the edge so that you can easily manoeuvre your machine cover. So your panel is now all prepared. We'll move on to making the ties and attaching those. We'll attach those to the side before finally binding all the way around the edge of our machine cover as the final stage. I forgot to mention earlier, when you are sewing all of the sewing the cover to its lining, it does make life easier, and in fact for doing the binding as well, if we just remove our thread catcher just whilst we're doing that, just because it then reduces the amount of bulk that we're sewing around. Anyway, I'm going to set that just to one side for a moment, and I'm going to grab my ties. So you will have cut 4 of these strips of fabric, and we're going to press these in half and in half again, and then sew around the edge of them to make our 4 ties. Okay, so I'll show you what I'm going to do with one of them, and then you're going to repeat the same with all 4. So start by just folding over the end and pressing down just one of the ends, give you a nice clean finish. The other end is going to get caught into the binding, so it doesn't matter. Then what we want to do is fold that in half. And then fold those raw edges into the middle. So kind of as if you were making a binding. You can do these one at a time if you find it easier. And then finally you want to fold in half again to make your tie. Then what we'll do is on each of the ties we should just sew all the way down that open edge and across the top. And we're going to repeat that process for all 4. And you can just pop some clips on there to hold them in place as well. So I've pressed and clipped all 4 ties. Let's go and sew them. So I'll just start there at the open end, and I'm sewing right on the edge. Come to the end, pivot round, a couple of stitches forward, a couple of stitches back, just to finish off. So that, I'll trim those threads down, but that is now completed, and I shall do the same for the other 3. I've made all of my ties. Now let's attach these to my cover. So looking at the wrong side, I want to measure down 22 centimetres from the seam there, and that is going to be the position of the top of my tie. So 22 centimetres down, and then I should just clip that in place there. And you want to do that for all 4. Then if you try that on your Ovelocker cover, do it up and just check. You may, depending again on your make and model of machine and the general shape of the machine, you may wish to move those further up or further down, but this is what I found worked for mine. So if you start off with 22 centimetres down from the seam here as a starting point, and then you can make some adjustments to suit your machine. Once you've got those ties in the right place, and you're happy that everything is fitting nicely and tying up nicely at the sides, then we're just going to hop on over to our sewing machine and just stitch the ties on in all 4 positions. Within the sort of 1 centimetre margin around the edge that will be covered by my binding, but by attaching these ties first, it's just going to make that a little bit easier. I have one less thing to manage when I'm attaching the binding in a minute. There we are. So we're now ready to attach our beautiful binding for the The finishing touch to this project, it's nice to keep these ties out of the way. When you've sewn your binding beautifully and perfectly, the last thing you want to realise is that you have also stitched your tie into your binding. It happens. So if you want to just tie those together in a knot or in a bow, and then they are out of the way. So before moving on to attaching our binding, you may like to just neaten up your edges just by trimming off any excess fabric. Sometimes your fabric won't match up beautifully, and if that happens and you just have some fabric hanging off the end, we can just trim that off. We want to give ourselves a really nice sharp edge to apply our binding to, just because that will make the binding sit really nicely. So you can just whiz round each corner. Don't get too happy with the old cutter. Just be nice and gentle and don't cut too much away. All you're doing really is trimming off any little bits of fluff and extra threads and anywhere that the fabric from the lining and the outside panel don't match up. You're just trimming away just to give yourself a really nice clean edge. So we'll start looking at the wrong side, and I want to start just at the centre back of the bottom, so somewhere inconspicuous. Now take your binding, and what I like to do is you may like to just pop a clip on there just to keep it together. I don't clip or pin my binding all the way around, I just work it as I go. So I just want to line that up here so that when I unfold that binding, the raw edge meets the raw edge of the bottom of my machine cover, and I just want to clip that in place. And then I'm going to start sewing here in the crease, and then I'm going to come all the way around the edge of my binding. So just check that you have enough binding to stretch all the way around the edge. You're going to leave a gap here, and you're going to want a nice generous tail of overlap for that gap, because I'm going to show you how to do a nice diagonal join in that as well. I'm also going to show you how to do the mitered corners. So we're going to start working now on the binding, lining up the raw edges there. We'll start with the back stitch, and I'm working on the back edge, so I'm working on the lining side to begin with. I'm sewing in the crease of the binding. What I want to do is I want to sew down this crease, and then when I get to about here, I'm going to pivot, and I want to sew with a 45-degree angle into that corner. So if you see my yellow chalk line, this is the line that I'm going to follow. With my needle down, I lift my presser foot, swivel round 45 degrees, and then I want to come off the end of that corner. So I'm going to use this diagonal here as a guideline. So I press my binding back and just finger press a fold there. So you can see that this corner here is a right angle, and this line that I've sewn dissects that in half. So we fold the binding back like this, and then we fold it back on itself, keeping it open at the raw edge side. We fold it back on itself so that these raw edges now match up. So you should have this triangle here, which is what's going to make your mitre. Okay, now when we start sewing again, let's put a clip in here to keep that there. When we start sewing again, we're going to sew down this line, okay? And we want this triangle of fabric to be out of the way. What you do not want to do, which a lot of people do, is sew this way and sew that down. You want this triangle to be free, because that way it can fold round to the front in a minute. So we'll reline up our binding so that it is matching up with the raw edge of my quilted machine cover, and then we're just going to come down here. So I'll put my needle back in here, going to carry on sewing until the next corner, and I'll do all those 4 corners the same way. I'm now approaching the area where I started sewing my binding on, so I shall just backstitch there so that I've got a nice gap there to do my join. I've got loads of leftover, so I'll just trim that off initially. And then what we want to do is we want this binding here to overlap by the same amount as the width of the binding. So what I can do is cut that one down there, and then with this piece here I'll open that out flat, and I want this binding to overlap by this binding by its width. So if I open that up, I can see that I want, oops, to cut this off here. Okay, so now I know that the binding here, the 2 tails of binding overlap by the same amount as the width of the entire binding. This is in order to get your beautiful join. Okay, now if you want to do an easy way of joining would just be simply to fold that up, place that on top and sew down there, and then you'll have a straight join. But I'm going to show you how to do a really nice neat diagonal join. So once you've trimmed that binding down, then bring your 2 bindings right sides together. But we're not going to sew a straight line, we're going to sew a diagonal line. So twist them this way and bring them together like this so that those corners meet. So you are crossing them over right sides together at right angles. And then we are going to sew, if you imagine where those 2 overlap, you've got a perfect square. We are going to sew a diagonal line through the centre of that square. So imagine where I'm putting my pin now is where I'm going to sew. So I'm sewing from this corner here, diagonal line through to this corner, so that when that then is sewn, you will end up with a beautiful diagonal join. Okay, so you're basically bringing them together, twisting them around so that they're at right angles, and we're going to sew across this diagonal line here. So I've lined that up under my machine now, and you can see that I'm just going to sew across that diagonal line, and then I'll be left with this right angle triangle here. So I'll take that pin out there now because it's not getting in my way. Do a back stitch to begin with as always, and then I'll just continue to sew along that diagonal line. And then I'll do a back stitch to finish. So I can just trim that triangle off. And press that open. I can just press it open with my fingers actually. You can go on over to your iron if you like. And then when I pull that closed, you have this lovely diagonal join that will just sit there. So what we can do now is just carry on where we were before, so where we stopped sewing before. Just sink your needle back down into those stitches, and then with that lovely diagonal join there, we can just carry on sewing. And that really does make a nice neat join, and it will show up much less than if you just did a straight fold. So we're going to continue sewing and then back stitch once we come back over the top of our stitches here. So now you've sewn your binding all the way around the edge, we just want to bring it forward to the front. So you can just pop those corners through and you'll see that you've got a lovely mitered corner there. So if you pop all of those around, now if you find that your binding doesn't want to stretch around your quilted panel, then you can just trim down carefully to help it come round to the front, okay? So let's start off doing one side at a time, or one corner at a time. We just want to press that forward like so. And so then that's pressed there, and then we just fold it up again to create a nice neat corner on the front side there. So just press your binding in and up and in and up on both sides. And we'll go all the way around the edge of our binding, pressing it in. But if I just show you how I do that corner there. So I'm pressing it in this way and then in this way, and then I've got a nice mitered joint there. And then what I'll do is, once I've pressed that binding all the way over to the front and held it in place with pins or clips all the way around, I just come onto my sewing machine, and looking at the right side this time, I will just come round and finish my binding off with a line of stitching all the way around the edge. And there we go. So I have now clipped my binding, folded my binding through to the front and clipped it all the way, folding in the corners, kind of like folding the end of a present, if you're wrapping a present. And then what we're going to do now is come over to our sewing machine, and just right on the edge there, we're going to sew all the way around our binding. So you'll get just the other side of your stitches on the inside there. But it's always best to do your final row of stitching on the front. If you're an experienced quilt maker, you may wish to do this the other way around, in which case you would just stitch in the ditch to finish off your binding. But I think for most beginner, confident beginner sewing enthusiasts, it's easier to do it this way round. So I will just start my sewing somewhere on the back, somewhere that's not going to show up too much. Stitch length I'm using is about between 2.6, 2.8. Just looks quite nice. There we are. So I've hand wound my needle there right into the edge, so you can see I'm just sewing right on the edge there. Back stitch to begin with. And then I'm just carefully sewing along the edge of that binding to finish off my cover.